And the more you grow up, you realize that if you've ever wanted to achieve something, if you've ever wanted to reach the pinnacle of whatever world it is that you live in, maybe you want to be an accountant, the best accountant, or the best lawyer, or whatever it may be. In my own journey, in my own path, one thing that I learned about, those dark days, when you go through that period where you're going to be fighting for yourself, fighting for what you believe, fighting for what you want to achieve, because like I always say, your path won't always be linear. You're never just going to have a straight path to reach whatever the goal that is that you want to reach is. It's not going to be as clear as you're going to keep going up, up, up until you reach the top. Like anything else, there are going to be seasons, there are going to be cycles in your journey. At some point in your journey, you might even find yourself stagnant. You might find yourself in spaces where, maybe things aren't moving as fast as you want them to, or maybe even you might find that, you might even have to stop, for a year or two or whatever it may be, but you have to just understand that, that stopping period, that period where things are going to be difficult, that period where you're going to be fighting for whatever it is, and trying to make it work, that period is there to grow you. That period is there to help you become stronger. They always say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but you have to understand that when you get to that place, you're going to need a certain level of resilience, a certain level of mental fortitude. The mind that you have when you're in your early 20s, when you're young, straight out of school, and you still believe that, you're gonna get everything you want, and you finally get your degree, you got to varsity, you did your best at varsity, you got your degree, and now post varsity there are no jobs. That's your point, that's your situation, that's your place where even though you thought it was just as clear as getting your degree and getting a job, now you're now in a space where there's no hope. Now there's no jobs available, the economy is saying something, and you're now in a position where you have to grind out to get to your position. You have to grind out to get to your goal. So that's what I'm trying to say, that when you get to that place, to that destination, to that location that you're trying to get to, I want you to understand that if you're trying to achieve big, if you're trying to reach a high place, you're going to have to become a certain type of person who's going to be able to hold their own weight in that place. When you get to that place, if you wanted to be a lawyer, you're going to be fighting cases with some of the best lawyers in the world. You're going to be fighting for incredibly rich people who, if you lose this case, you're going to lose so much for someone, for some people, for a whole group of people, for a whole business. Who knows what you might be fighting for? And when you get to that place, the period in which you had to learn, the period in which you had to grow, when you had to do the small cases, when you had to do the small bits, when people were making you, be their puppet and pet and that's the period that's gonna give you the mental fortitude and the mental resilience for you to be able to hold your own weight when you get to that place that you're trying to get to. And that's what I'm trying to say to you guys, that I'm on my own journey in my own life. I've taken a different stance now to understanding that difficult part. I've taken a different stance to understanding adversity that comes into my life, challenges that come into my life, because now I have the understanding, that the difficult bits, the points where you're being tested, where your mind is being squeezed, and you have to grind it out, and you need to have faith and believe that you're going to get to your destination. When you're now in a group of people, when you've reached your destination, when you're now that top lawyer and that rich businessman is looking to you to fight for his family, to fight for his life, are you going to be the guy who cheated his way to the top and now you're going to start shaking in big moments because you haven't had your test yet? Are you going to be the guy who, when everyone and anyone is relying on you, you're going to disappoint them because you've never had the hardship, the testing, the grooming that you needed to have in order for you to carry a weight of that load? So like I said, in my own journey, in my own life, I changed the stance by now being grateful and being thankful to the challenges that come into my life. It's because that other people try to attack me, and me having to find strength and understand who I am and grow as an individual and become who I had to become only because of the attack that came upon me, only because of the bad luck, only because of the circumstances that came my way, I was able to become a stronger version of myself. So therefore, the challenges that are coming into your life, you have to be, to an extent, grateful to them. You have to be thankful to them. When I see myself one day in a position where I'm meant to deliver, and it's an impossible situation, but it's still done, I have to thank the challenges in my journey, in this period that I've been in, where I've had to deal with so much of life not necessarily going my way, but still having to keep my mental frame, still having to believe that there's a destination, there's a hope, that there's a future, that God has something better in store for me. So now that faith that came from the challenges that were placed on me, the attacks or whatever it may be that I had to go through, that caused so much of bad circumstances to come my way, whatever that was, I have to love it. I have to be thankful for it, because that is what made me great. That is what tested me to become a better version of myself. And without it, I wouldn't have been this person. I always look back at some of my old videos of who I used to be and how I used to think, how I used to view the world. And looking back at, that version of myself, I see that I needed that to happen. As much as I hated it, as much as it was painful, as much as I suffered the whole way through, as much as they made it as difficult as it could possibly be, as much as they tried to kill me in every way, shape or form, emotionally, mentally, and all these ways in which they were trying to get at my mental frame and failed. As much as they were difficult, I needed them. They are the reason why I'll be who I'll be, because without the challenge, without the hardship, this version of me doesn't exist. So I'm grateful to the ones who hurt me. I'm grateful to those who hate me. I'm grateful to my enemies. I'm thankful to my enemies, because without them, I wouldn't be me. If people, if systems, if whatever it was that was against me wasn't there, I wouldn't be there. So they made me. They grew my willpower. They grew my mental fortitude. They grew my mental resilience.